All right, so John Fetterman continues to be one of the best Democratic Senate candidates that I've seen in a while. He is now calling on President Joe Biden, who is about to go do a trip to Pennsylvania in Pittsburgh, calling on him to officially decriminalize marijuana. So, hear from Joe Calvello, who is the Director of Communications for John Fetterman. They put out a statement here, and he says, Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman on Monday called on President Joe Biden to use his existing authority to deschedule marijuana from its classification as a Schedule 1 drug and work to decriminalize marijuana. And John Fetterman said, it's long past time that we finally decriminalize marijuana. The president needs to use his executive authority to begin deschedulizing it, and I would love to see him do this prior to his visit in Pittsburgh. So he's really trying to put a little bit of pressure here on Joe Biden. And he says this is just common sense, and Pennsylvanians overwhelmingly support decriminalizing marijuana. He also continued here to give a little bit of a dig at Dr. Oz. He said, I don't want to hear any bullshit coming out of Dr. Oz's campaign trying to conflate decriminalizing marijuana with seriously harmful crime. Are we supposed to believe that neither he or any members of his staff have ever used marijuana? And as mayor of Braddock, I made it my mission to combat serious crime. I mean, we're talking about a guy here, John Fetterman, who literally has like the dates, I think, of the shootings that took place in Braddock, Pennsylvania. So, I mean, this guy is like fully committed to actually addressing crime in a meaningful capacity, whereas somebody like Dr. Oz just virtue signals about it and really just wants to continue doing these, bullshit war on drugs and continuing to have just a mass incarceration state and a police state. But John Fetterman is actually somebody who has like a track record and knows what it means to attempt to legitimately deploy criminal justice reform. But he says, I know firsthand what real crime looks like, and marijuana does not fit the bill. It's time to end the hypocrisy on the issue once and for all. So credit to John Fetterman for, not only coming out with some like vague statement about his support for marijuana legalization or decriminalization, but actually like directly adding President Joe Biden while he's about to go on this trip to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So, I mean, absolutely love to see it. He's 100% correct on virtually all of the points that he was just making there. In terms of the overall support across the country, we're currently sitting at a record high historically with 68% of Americans saying that they support legal marijuana. So not just decriminalizing it, but also effectively legalizing it. We also had this story that broke just a couple days ago now. They say here that smoking weed is now more popular than tobacco as legalization is on the ballot in a number of states. So more popular than tobacco, and it is especially like this with younger generations as well. So good job, everybody. Keep it up. I'm very proud of my fellow young weed smokers and stuff. But the fact that weed is currently being used at a higher level than tobacco, and still we have tobacco which is legalized and marijuana is not legalized and is criminalized in this country, just completely fucking ridiculous. I mean, tobacco and cigarettes and all of that shit does significantly more damage to people in terms of their health than marijuana does. So the idea that like we're going to keep tobacco legalized, but we're going to keep marijuana criminalized in this country, it makes absolutely no fucking sense, especially considering that obviously people aren't listening to the laws right now and are going to be smoking weed anyways, which kind of just gets to the heart of the overall failures of the war on drugs. But we'll tie that back into a previous Nixon aide and his statement on what exactly the war on drugs was actually supposed to be about. Hint, it had absolutely nothing to do with bettering society or improving public safety or protecting kids or whatever the fuck other narratives that they came up with at the time. But just a little bit more statistics and information in terms of how many people are sitting behind bars right now because marijuana is criminalized in this country. In part, thanks to Joe Biden himself, who was always a vehement drug warrior throughout basically his entire career in the Senate. So, in terms of whether or not we could expect Joe Biden to actually do this, I have my obvious doubts on that. But, if he actually did, I think honestly that would be like basically a silver bullet for Democrats in terms of showing up their support with the base of young people, minority people within the United States. It would definitely consolidate that base for Democrats before the midterms. But in addition to that, you would also have Republicans just coming out and making the most asinine arguments against marijuana and have like a full revitalization of reefer madness and shit like that, which I think would be incredibly alienating for the Republican Party. So it's like, a double-edged sword there, but both in favor of the Democrats. So if you actually wanted to, completely guarantee that you are going to outperform in the midterms and guarantee that the American people are going to see how completely ridiculous and authoritarian conservatives are right now, then this would be the perfect thing to do. But Again, a little bit more information here in terms of the current state of the U.S. prison industrial complex. They say here that the U.S. is home to 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its prisoners. So again, as motherfuckers like, Dr. Oz or other conservatives as well constantly come out here and preach about freedom and how we're the freest country on earth, turns out that in a very literal sense, we have significantly less freedoms for millions of people across the country who are locked away behind bars, way more proportionately and in total numbers than any other country on the face of the planet. So, in terms of like actually expanding freedom in this country, maybe we should start with addressing our completely broken and dysfunctional and bloated criminal justice system. But to put this in a different perspective, because this is just how absolutely insane the current situation is, they say here from prisonpolicy.org that if you had every U.S. state basically listed as an individual country and then compared those prison rates with the rest of the world, I mean, look at this. You have every single U.S. state here basically. I mean, you have Louisiana, Mississippi, all of these are basically above the average for the United States, which is in blue here. But then continue. I mean, what is this? The top 30, the top 20 at least states within the United States outperform in terms of their incarceration rates relative to other entire countries around the world. And, the first country down here that is not the United States or one of our various states within this country is Cuba. And they're sitting at like an incarceration rate of 510, whereas the United States is up here at 716. So, I mean, again, it's just not even remotely close to any other developed country around the world. We are very unique in terms of how many people we are locking behind bars. Also have to mention, obviously, the slave labor that is being conducted at a lot of these prisons and jails around the United States. I mean, people being paid pennies on the dollar, if anything at all, and having to do basically slave labor again for the profits of corporations that have contracts with the prisons here in the United States. So just absolutely completely insane situation. But that's part of the reason why our numbers in our prison system are as high as they are, is because a lot of these places, these jails, these state prisons, they have like literal quotas because they have contracts with private corporations who rely on having bodies in those beds so that they can exploit them for cheap or free labor. And so then you have these quotas where people, working within law enforcement or, the judicial system then have to basically fill up those beds, right? So there's a direct financial incentive to continue having these bloated prisons that we have right now. But another piece of data here from the same Prison Policy Institute, they say that 1 in 5 incarcerated people is locked up for a drug offense. 1 in 5. So we could reduce our prison population by 1/5 alone if we just started to address the completely broken and failed war on drugs and released all of the nonviolent drug offenders. But one more bit of statistics here directly from the U.S. government. They have here, this is basically just the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So this is not like state level prisons or state level jails or stuff like that. This is just at the federal level. And I mean, look at the outlier here, right? There's one bar that significantly goes above every single other type of offense, and it is unsurprisingly drug offenses, which apparently make up 45% of the federal prison population right now. So again, completely fucking insane situation, but also, we have additional costs of the war on drugs, not just in terms of the humanitarian aspect of that and the political aspect of that, but also just purely on economics, right? They say here from CNBC, America has spent over $1 trillion fighting the war on drugs, and 50 years later, drug use in the U.S. is climbing again. So, this gets down to the fundamental flaw with the war on drugs, right? You are never going to beat drugs in terms of going about it in a criminalization approach and going about it by expanding the police state and throwing more people behind jails and ruining their lives and increasing the likelihood that once they get out of jails, if they get out, that they are just going to be, falling back on the same habits. You cannot go about it in this way, okay? If you actually wanted to defeat the cartels, if you actually wanted to defeat drugs in the sense that people are not dying on the streets and overdosing at ridiculously high levels here in the U.S., then what you would do is you would decriminalize all of these and then give people access, universal access that is guaranteed to everybody for whether it's mental health treatment or whether it's addiction treatment or, safe injection sites, so many different policies that have already been demonstrated in other developed countries around the world who have way better prison systems in terms of their recidivism rates, way better prisons in terms of the amount of people that are sitting in them. And, overall, the war on drugs has just been a complete abject failure from any angle that you want to look at it, whether it's economic, whether it's political, whether it's, getting into the humanitarian costs of how many millions of people's lives have been just absolutely destroyed or actually ended as a a result of the war on drugs. But now we get to the Nixon aide quote, which is something that I bring up a lot when I'm talking about the war on drugs, because, we could break down all of the statistics, we could break down how flawed this entire project has been, but at the end of the day, really the best testimony you could get on this is just straight from the mouth of somebody who helped to launch the war on drugs, who has just openly and explicitly admitted that this was for political purposes to target the enemies of Richard Nixon. So here from CNN, they say, report: aide says that Nixon's war on drugs targeted blacks and hippies. So we have a direct quote here. They say that the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies: the anti-war left and black people. Former Nixon domestic policy chief John Ehrlichman told Harper's writer Dan Baum for the April cover story published on Tuesday. And he said, "You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing them both heavily, we could disrupt those communities." And he said we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know that we were lying about drugs? The drugs? Of course we did. So again, I mean, you could just hear it straight from the horse's mouth of the people who initially launched the war on drugs, and they just straight up admitted it. I mean, there was never any actual logical initiation for starting the war on drugs. It was just complete political persecution to go after the anti-war left, to go after disproportionately leftist movements, especially black liberation movements, the feds, and as part of the war on drugs, but also as part of, cracking down on black liberation movements as well. They tried to go after Martin Luther King Jr. At the time, the FBI, the CIA considered him to be a communist threat to the national security of the U.S. Obviously, the government played a direct role in the assassination of Fred Hampton. We could go down the line and talk about this, but at the end of the day, you can hear it directly from a former Nixon aide himself, just straight up admitting that this is a completely failed project. It was initiated explicitly to go after his own personal political enemies, and at the end of the day, we are just left with the ongoing consequences because, we have a government in Congress that is unwilling or unable to actually pass legislation to decriminalize or legalize a lot of these drugs, and to pass a lot of those policies that would also aid and abet that process to, help us transition away from this criminalization. But on top of that, the failures of the Congress in acting on this legislatively, we also have a president right now who was one of the biggest promoters of the war on drugs. So, credit to John Fetterman for coming out here and trying to put a little bit of pressure on him. Obviously, I have my doubts that he is actually going to act on this in a meaningful way, but it's good that we have, potential senators right now that are actually trying to apply a significant degree on pressure, especially on somebody like Joe Biden, who is a vehement drug warrior and always has been throughout his entire career. Remember that story that we had at the beginning of the Biden administration where he was firing some of the people who were working in the White House if they had previously used marijuana? So so many different reasons to believe that this is not a realistic request or that it's not going to be acted on. But again, the benefits of doing something like this would be absolutely unimaginable, both in the humanitarian sense, in the economic sense, to stop dumping money into this failed war on drugs, and also in the political sense, because again, you would have somebody like Joe Biden, whose approval rating is slightly starting to tick up, especially among young people with the mild student debt cancellation that he came out with. But if he did this, that would 100% shore up his support from young people and from disproportionately minority communities that have been disproportionately affected by the war on drugs, and would be an absolutely massive political dub. So maybe, let's not hold our breath or anticipate anything coming from Biden on this. But if he did this, that would be absolutely insane. And again, having more senators in our legislative body like John Fetterman, who are openly making these types of arguments, is definitely going to be a positive thing.